Hi, everyone. Peggy Kamuf is Marion Francis Chevalier Professor of French and Comparative Literature at University of Southern California. She is one of the leading translators of Derrida's work into English, and she is the administrator of Derrida's archives in the US. She also trains the next generation of Derrida scholars through the Institute for Contemporary Publishing Archives, IMEC. In 2010, I was so excited that she agreed to keynote for the Derrida Today Conference, which was co-hosted with Simon Morgan-Wortham and Martin McQuillan from Kingston University in London. Today, I can't quite believe my luck that Peggy Kamuf agreed to keynote a second time for Derrida Today, and during what seems to be a never-ending pandemic as well. And so I'm delighted that she is keynoting today, not just because of her remarkable career, and I refer you to Michael Nass's work, where he talks a lot about Peggy's career. And a long list of books and publications, but because her work matters. It matters because of the sophistication and sharpness of her style and ideas that has a transformational influence on the work of those in the Derrida community, including myself. Subtle, rich, complex, like a beautiful wine, her writing and thinking inspires and affects the way we not only think about Derrida's work, but the world in general. And testament to this is the Renée Ouellette Prize for Literary and Cultural Theory, American Comparative Literature Association, for her book of addresses, published by Stanford University Press. Other books in her corpus include Fiction of Feminine Desire by University of Nebraska Press, Signature Pieces, Cornell University Press, the Division of Literature, or the University in Deconstruction, University of Chicago Press. And of course, recently to follow the wake of Jacques Derrida. Please give a very warm welcome to Professor Peggy Kamuf.
Gosh, Nicole, that was over the top. But I appreciate it very much. Just one correction. I am no longer Marion Francis Chevalier, Professor of French, blah, blah, blah. But since I retired, that title has passed to my colleague, Lydie Moudileno. Although the paper I'm about to read was initially written for another occasion, in a time out of joint sort of way, it seemed already to address this gathering of readers of Derrida today. The first occasion was a conference in Madrid on Derrida and Heidegger, which took place in October 2019. And that turned out to be, it will have been, by the foresight of the anterior future, my last journey outside the US before the pandemic lockdowns took effect. A suspension hold was then put on everything, as you remember, in particular on the Derrida Today Conference, and in still more particular, on the panel Thomas Clément Mercier, ici présent, someplace, Thomas, the panel that Thomas was organizing with my agreed participation. Oh, I forgot to change my glasses, okay. The theme of that panel, Life Power, was thus already in prospect when, as you were going to hear, I revisited moments of Derrida's reading of Walton, Puissance, Power, in Heidegger, in The Beast and the Sovereign, the second volume. But there is address to readers of Derrida here or there, but if there is address to readers of Derrida here or there today, if it is a general address, what's called a keynote address, then the key to that generality is this designation of readers. We assemble, don't we, as readers of the Derrida text in all its vast extensions, in all its vast dissemination of differences. Allow me then to latch on to this key and to wonder out loud for a short while about readers and reading, while doing so in the company of Derrida as he reflects on reading, his reading and reading in general, but also as he practices it or undergoes it. Derrida reader Derrida, comma, reader, could have been the title for this talk, which might have allowed us to register the near anagram in English of that proper name, rewritten as our common noun, we readers of Derrida Today. My title is Reading Idioms, and it comes from a passage in the second volume of The Beast and the Sovereign, near the beginning of the 8th session. Derrida has just recalled for his readers the necessity of reading the two texts he has just juxtaposed in, quote, a linear, continuous, and repeated way. He invokes next another necessity, less obvious, in a seminar where the work is, as he puts it, not a simple reading. This other necessity is that of making leaps. There are so many new perspectives from a turn in the text, from a stretch of path that gives you another view of the whole, unquote. It is at this point, and thank you, it is at this point that the path of the sentence that Derrida is following and constructing itself takes a turn and launches itself on the road of a long comparison with driving a car on a mountain road. Here is the continuation of the sentence, and it's the first quote up there if you can read it. Like, for example, when you're driving a car on a road, a hairpin or a turn, an abrupt and precipitous elevation suddenly gives you in an instant a new perspective on the whole, or a large part of the itinerary, or of what orients, designs, or destines it. And here there intervene not only each person's reading idioms with their history, their way of driving, in the mountains or on the flat, on dirt roads or on highways, following this or that map, this or that route. And I interrupt the sentence for a moment. I'll come back to it and finish it. If I lifted from this sentence the phrase reading idioms, idiome de lecture, it is because it inscribes itself in an example of such an idiom, which one might call Derrida at the wheel. And I say that thinking of Michael Ness, which an elided parenthesis lays claim to this way. Second quote. It goes without saying that each of my choices and my perspectives depends broadly here, as I will never try to hide, on my history, my previous work, and my way of driving on this road, on my drives, desires, and phantasms, even if I always try to make them both intelligible, shareable, convincing, and open to discussion. So Derrida is at the wheel of this reading that proceeds by leaps and putting into new perspectives, which means that his history, his earlier work, his drives, desires, and phantasms steer according to their idioms. These idioms intervene, he says, at the moment of the leap and the choice, when the direction or the road to take has to be decided. Later on, I'm going to ask what it is that pushes one to leap or to choose. The long twisting sentence that I've begun to read, several of whose turns I've described, is going to continue to the end of the paragraph, 10 lines below. It is a matter of completing by a but also the syntax that was opened by a not only at the beginning of this sentence, which I quote again, and here there intervene not only each person's reading idioms. So what else then intervenes at this juncture of the path or reading? Well, precisely the crossing of another path. When Derrida at the wheel of the seminar makes the decision to let paths cross. Here is the rest of this paragraph. So it's quote number 3. And here there intervene not only each person's reading idioms, but also the crossing, the decision, already taken and imposed on you by fiat as soon as it was proposed to you to read a given seminar by Heidegger and Robinson Crusoe, i.e., two paths, two discourses, also on the way and on the path, which can multiply the perspectives from which two vehicles can light up their headlights, crossing the overall cartography and the landscape in which we are traveling and driving together on all these paths, interlaced, intercut, overloaded with bridges, fords, no entries, or one-way streets, etc. It's a very long sentence. It's hard not to lose your way. In this ultimate seminar, Derrida proliferated over the course of the sessions such moments of reflection on what is happening or may happen at such an unexpected, unusual intersection as this crossing of Heidegger with Defoe, the serious thinker with the writer of fictions. Dasein with the eponymous character in the novel Robinson Crusoe. The choice to cross these paths of paths, these two discourses on the way and on the path, intervenes, Derrida says, by fiat, and following that decision imposed as soon as it was proposed. Who else would have imposed this fiat if not the one who was at the wheel of the seminar and who dissolves here into the figure of a we who are driving together? Who else? Unless this fiat imposed by something else of which Derrida's reading idioms would be the relay. But there again, the question may be asked, what is pushing, what is driving this choice, the leap between two shores that are so distant from each other? The leap that throws a bridge between two such dissimilar texts gives its momentum to the seminar itself, where precisely it will often be a question, as we will see, of leaps. Not only does this figure return several times along Derrida's path, but it marks strong moments in the reading of the two principal texts by Heidegger and Defoe. First of all, however, it is in a reading of Kant that Derrida insists on a certain leap, executed by reason when it must orient itself among invisible things in the supra-sensible. Derrida summarizes the passage he is reading of this text by Kant with the essay, What is Orientation in Thinking? And then he takes a further step or leap. This is quote 4. The point then is to extend the always subjective but sensory principle of orientation to the right of reason, the right of the need proper to reason to orient itself in thought on the basis of a principle that is always subjective, of course, but this time carried beyond the sensory field and into the black night of the suprasensible, and thus the invisible, the met-empirical. This leap into the night, the leap of right on the basis of need, is an infinite leap, an infinite extension. Derrida arrived at this leap in Kant by following Heidegger's choice of a path when faced with the aporetic question, was ist Welt? What is the world, or what is world? How does one orient oneself, Derrida asks, before such a question? How can one ever approach this question on the all and the nothing? Was ist Welt? Was ist Welt? No less. How not to remain paralyzed? Well, Heidegger approaches, or rather, he makes a gesture, writes Derrida, and this attention to gestures in his reading of Heidegger, here as well as elsewhere, has always struck me. It is no doubt one of his reading idioms. For him to read is also to practice remarking and following up to a certain point what he calls the gestures of a text. And it is especially to question them as to their meaning to say and their force, what I will call in a moment their poussance. So Heidegger makes a gesture. What is it? He decides, writes Derrida, without thematizing the sense and necessity of this decision, he will have taken the decision to make the gesture that consists in determining the difficulty or the aporia as the figure of direction, the path to be taken. Earlier, Derrida had underscored this choice, this gesture, or this leap that remains unreflected by Heidegger, Derrida remarks. Just as he remarks here that Heidegger does not thematize the sense and necessity of this decision. It is precisely as unreflected and unthematized that the gesture makes a gesture and gives itself to be read as such. We will see later the scope of this figure of the leap in the seminar's reading of Heidegger. But before getting there, two other leaps are marked or quoted on Derrida's path. In Defoe, first of all, even though, as with Kant and Heidegger, apropos his gesture of choosing a path, it is Derrida who introduces the term leap, saut in French. And I would even say he forces it on the text. In question here is the passage where Robinson is congratulating himself for his invention of a wheel, precisely, with which to turn his pottery. After having quoted this passage, Derrida comments, and this is quote number 5. A wheel produces these pots, which are his work, not only better and more easily, but infinitely better and more conveniently, which means, and it's true, that there is an infinite leap between, on the one hand, any instrument, any tool as an extension of the body, and on the other, the autonomous machine called a wheel, which does without us in finishing and rounding things off perfectly. The leap and the rupture in the production of the prosthesis are absolute. So here is another infinite leap, not into the night of the supersensible as in Kant, but a technical leap beyond the body, extended by a prosthesis toward the autonomous machine. Robinson thus retraces a leap in this history of technology. At least Derrida leaps on this scene in order to bring out the sense of a leap. As for the other leap, it is found in a quotation, and Derrida does not remark on it in particular. It is a long passage from Thomas l'Obscur by Blanchot, quoted in the eighth session, alongside other long passages from Maurice Blanchot, 2 days after the cremation of this writer, at which Derrida had been present. In this passage, Thomas faces up to the void, and the word void or vide returns insistently in these lines. He faces up to the void and to the impossibility of dying. It is then that the narrating voice compares him to a man who is trying to hang himself. So this is quote number 6, and it is Blanchot, quoted by Derrida in this session. Like the man who hangs himself, having pushed away the stool on which he was still standing, the last shore, instead of feeling the leap he is making into the void, feels only the rope that holds him, held to the end more than ever attached, bound as never before to the existence from which he would like to detach himself. Thomas, too, at the moment at which he knew himself to be dead, felt absent, quite absent from death. So Derrida does not comment on this other infinite leap, the impossible leap into the impossibility of dying. He thus lets resonate the void that subtends any leap, whether or not it is suicidal. But let us come now to the juncture in his seminar where Derrida blows up the very figure of the leap, in its difference from another step. He is reading, commenting, translating, and/or interpreting, or all those things at once, paragraph 73 of Heidegger's seminar, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where it is indeed question of a certain leap, of an Absprung. So literally this time, Derrida does not have to introduce the word, except changing language. Heidegger is speaking of the possibility, the Möglichkeit, of the either true or else false, in which consists the essence of the logos. One must grasp this, says Heidegger, so as to find the place from which to leap backward toward the origin, the Ursprung. Once again, Derrida leaps on this leap, this Absprung. So this is quote number 7. The essence of logos, recalls Heidegger, depends on the fact that in it resides the possibility, Möglichkeit, of the either true or else false, or the not only positive but also negative. This possibility is the internal essence of logos. It is only if we grasp this that the leap, Absprung, the jump or the jumping off point of the jumper, the high jumper or the parachute jumper, the Absprung, which will lead us to the Ursprung, to the origin, here to the origin of the logos, operates. We still have here the figure of the path, even the circular path, with a step backward, Schritt zurück, or a leap, a jumping off point. We will be able to move backward toward the origin. The step is a leap, always. Every step leaps. The difference between the step and the leap is difficult to grasp. Every step is a leap. Here we're dealing with the backward step of the leap, or the jumping off point, Absprung, of the logos. And this jumping off point, the place for jumping, Ort des Absprungs, is the internal essence of logos as co-originary possibility of the true or false, the positive or the negative. End of that quote. Are we? Okay. Thank you, Julian. You're great help. So the step is a leap, always. And this sense is immediately repeated as every step leaps. And then again, every step is a leap. So 3 times in the course of those 2 lines. This categorical affirmation and reaffirmation is called up by the occurrence of the figure of the Absprung in this passage, where what interests Derrida and draws his suspicion is the passage precisely, the step taken between possibility and power. That is, between Möglichkeit and Vermögen. A passage facilitated by their common root, mögen. But in Derrida's view, this should not dissimulate what is at stake in this leap. Not backward this time toward the origin, but forward toward a power of Dasein alone to relate to beings as such. Derrida remarks this other leap between possibility and power, between Möglichkeit and Vermögen, as what Heidegger wanted to pass off as a simple translation or explication. So this is quote number 8. And then with the leap, and as we can rightly say here, and at this point Derrida recognizes that when he's been speaking of leaps, it hasn't always been literally in the text, but this time here it is in Heidegger as Absprung. As we can rightly say here, Heidegger moves from possibility to power as though he were merely translating and making explicit Möglichkeit. He says in the very next sentence, emphasizing the word Vermögen, wir sagen, ist ein Vermögen zu. We say that it is a power for. And immediately, and this is what authorizes me to find here the mediating schema with Walton, This power is defined as the power of the relation to beings as such as they are. End of quote. So by following in this way the vocabulary of the leap, by leaping from leap to leap, as we have been doing, one ends up intersecting, as we just saw, with the principal preoccupation of the seminar, that is, with Walton. What is more, it has led us to the point where Derrida makes the link between the beast and the sovereign in Heidegger's thought. For this passage, or this leap from possibility to power, also marks the limit between the animal and Dasein. The animal is that which does not accede to this Vermögen, to this power, defined as power of the relation to beings as such. This is the trait shared with Walton. Some 10 pages later, after having remarked a similar passage in Lacan from possibility to power that marks the difference with the animal, Derrida returns to Heidegger and highlights the question of, and this is quote 9, what is happening here when the power of as such, when the ontological difference comes to be possible and to accord a power, to accord itself a power, to accord itself with a power and a power to relate to it, Vermögen, Verhalten. Parenthetically, I'll just add, I find this sentence fragment, especially in French, this sentence fragment has an extraordinary syntactic, rhythmic, semantic, but also philosophic and poetic force. And opening a new paragraph, Derrida writes, quote, this is where the word Walton appears, unquote. That is, it surgit, it suddenly appears or looms up. It's a surgissement, a looming or surging up. The word looms up, where a power gives itself sovereignly the force to leap between possibility and power, which is the power to relate to itself, to relate itself to ontological difference. Much earlier in the fourth session, the same word, surgir, qualifies the difference made between being and beings, the difference that is said to surgir, spring from a certain Walton. Once again, Derrida is speaking of the animal, such as Heidegger describes it. This is quote 10. What the animal is lacking is not supposedly access to the entity, but access to the entity as such, i.e. that slight difference between being and beings that, as we shall see, springs from, surgit de, what can only be called a certain Walton. At the point of this looming, rising, or surging up, there is thus access to ontological difference, to a power that not only does not belong to the animal, but that designates, quote, a sovereignty so sovereign that it exceeds the theological and political, and especially ontotheological figures or determinations of sovereignty. The beast and the sovereign, in sum, divided by a blow or a leap of Walton. Perhaps I am associating too freely this surging up of Walton with leaps, with that propulsion toward or over or between that will have given this seminar its so very singular form. Walton leaps to Derrida's eyes upon rereading Heidegger in the company of Defoe under the double sign of the beast and the sovereign. And Walton constitutes the most continuous and insistent guiding thread across the 10 sessions, of which only one, the sixth, makes no mention. Derrida repeats more than once that the common French translations of Walton are insufficient, and he underscores that the word remains untranslatable. For example, in the fourth session, again, after having said Walton is a force, he adds during the session, I put the word force in quotation marks because it does not satisfy me any more than the word violence. And here is another similar remark from very near the end of the seminar, quote 11. What reigns, waltet, what imposes itself, what imposes its power and its force and its potency, 3 words, force, power, potency, that I use prudently, like the word violence, for Walton does not necessarily literally mean to reign, if reign implies a royalty, nor to dominate, if dominate implies a sovereign lord and master, nor force, power, and potency and violence, although all these words, to reign, dominate, force, power, potency, violently impose oneself, etc., are so many virtual connotations, potential precisely, potentially potent, en puissance de puissance, in every use of Walton. And I underscored that phrase, en puissance de puissance, which holds Walton on the edge of all these connotations, because it resonates curiously with another family of French words that Derrida associates with Walton. It is at the moment in which he is considering the relation between Walton and Getriebenheit that figures at the beginning of Heidegger's seminar. The word surges up, so to speak, from the Novalis fragment that Heidegger begins to follow on the path that starts out from the question on the essence of philosophy. And this is Heidegger, or rather, this is Novalis, as quoted by Heidegger. Philosophy is properly nostalgia, a drive, trieb, to be everywhere at home, says Novalis in this fragment. From this nostalgic trieb or drive, Heidegger is going to unfold Getriebenheit, and he will say that it is our very being. Unser Sein ist diese Getriebenheit. Now, this is the sentence that figures toward the beginning of what Derrida calls an extraordinary paragraph, and that he is going to read very closely. What interests him so much here, as he explains during the session, is, quote, the relation between trieb and Walton. Now, trieb is most often translated in French by pulsion, by drive in English. And Derrida adopts more or less these translations, or this translation. But you are going to hear how he folds and unfolds his language around this figure of pulsion, to call it that for the moment, before remarking during the session, I quote, what is named trieb or Getriebenheit is thus unnameable in the strict sense of the term. This is not yet another remark about the translation or untranslatability of these German words, but rather about what is not nameable in one language any more than in the other. Despite that, or rather for this reason, Derrida is going to multiply names, but also verbs. He is, I would say in French, going to multiplier, surplier, multifold, overfold his language as if it were a matter of supplying this noun or verb or vocable that is missing. And I'm going to quote several sentences to illustrate what I'm trying to describe here. This is quote number 12. We must stop a moment on this last sentence. Unser Sein ist diese Getriebenheit, and on the word getrieben. We must recognize that this Getriebenheit, that is none other than our very being, unser Sein, now determines both the world as that toward which it pushes us and the nostalgia that pushes us. The nostalgia, this unique nostalgia, has no limit. It is our being, inasmuch as it is this urge or this drive, this trieb of Getriebenheit. As this Getriebenheit also determines the world as that towards which this push of an essential and originary nostalgia pushes us, it is not one drive or urge among others. Everything comes from it then. All comes back to it, to the push, to the pushing of this trieb, this drive. And here we have to look at the French, à la poussée de ce trieb, de cette pulsion. This mobility among nouns and verbs, between nominalized verb and verbalized noun, among la pousse, la poussée, et la pulsion, will be taken up again at the end of the paragraph I am reading and repeating. And I continue quoting 13. It is the trieb that sets us on the path and keeps us on the path. But as it is a movement, a process, a tendency, a force rather than a thing, a process without determinate subject or object, before any determined subject or object, before any entity, before any who or any what, the very word, the nominal or nominalized form of the vocable trieb, Getriebenheit, is problematic and must be read as such. We can say the same about the drive or the push and even the force. It pushes, ça pousse, but where it pushes, there is not yet either drive or push or pulse or being pushed or a being doing the pushing. Now, it's in the midst of these lines that Derrida intervenes to issue a warning about the words he is using here. Trieb and Getriebenheit, but especially force, concerning which he remarks, this is why I am hesitant to translate it as the force. It is not the force either, but a forcing, a forcement, an enforcing. And that in French is un forçage, un forcement, un efforcement. It is not a force in the substantial, subjective, or objective sense of the word. So notice how he is forcing the noun force out of its substantive state toward the nominalized verb, a forcing, a forcement, and an enforcing, that would be neither subjective nor objective, neither action nor passion, but perhaps something like that third voice, with which Derrida forged or exploited numerous nouns into his objects of thought, beginning, of course, with différence, but also aimance, arrivance, errance, among many others. Thus, the word poussance might have assumed a place in this series. Not puissance, power, potency, but la poussance of trieb and of Walten, of what puts all beings on the way, according to Heidegger. Physis itself, there where everything grows, that is, pousse and dies. Or rather, not la poussance, but merely de la poussance, with the partitive rather than the definite article. I like to think that Derrida would have accepted the word. But it is the recurrence not of Trieb or Getriebenheit, but of Walten in all its forms across Heidegger's oeuvre that keeps Derrida's attention during the seminar. 3 times he remarks that the frequency of this word and word family has passed more or less unnoticed by readers of Heidegger. As he puts it, this is a recurring word that, in my opinion, is given too little attention in Heidegger in general. As he says at one point in the second session, where he begins his reading of this recurrence. And much later, the second time he makes the remark, after having signaled that, quote, this is where the word Walten appears, surgit, he adds that this word is, quote, scarcely noticed by all the readers of Heidegger I think I know. As for the third occurrence of this remarking of the non-remark, it's not far from the end of the seminar, when Derrida makes a kind of confession to his listeners. And this is quote number 14. As you see, late in my life of reading Heidegger, I have just discovered a word that seems to oblige me to put everything in a new perspective. And this is what happens and ought to be meditated on endlessly. If I had not conjoined in one problematic the beast and the sovereign, I wager that the force and organizing power of this German word that is so difficult to translate, but that informs, gives form to the whole Heideggerian text, would never have appeared to me as such, any more than it has appeared to my knowledge to others. It's a kind of confession, I said, but at stake is also a certain wager. This wager wagers actually nothing, since luck will have already played in favor of the wagerer. I paraphrase, here's the wager. If I had not forged this double problematic of the beast and the sovereign, I wager that I would not have remarked the organizing power of Walton in the Heideggerian text. That is, if I had not done what I did, I'm paraphrasing now, if I had not leaped between the beast and the sovereign, between Defoe and Heidegger, then I wager what has happened would not have happened. But, he says, this is what happens and ought to be meditated on endlessly. It is the luck of a leap that can oblige one to put everything in a new perspective, just as the headlights of two cars that cross in the night put the landscape in a different perspective, to take up again the driving analogy from the beginning of this talk. What luck, then, to have joined the beast and the sovereign, Robinson Crusoe, in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics. What luck. So what can one say about the fact that this wager seems to have been lost as soon as it is uttered? Here in the last session of what will have been in his lifetime, to recall this phrase that made Derrida smile ruefully, no less than the phantasmatic after your lifetime. This last session of what will have been his last written engagement with Heidegger. Since when was everything put into a new perspective for him by Walton? When Derrida writes, "This is what happens," is he speaking also of the forgetting of what he had already remarked in a text from 1989, that is 14 years earlier, Heidegger's Ear, Philopolemology. Several times in Heidegger's Ear, Derrida underscores the insistence of Walton as that which dominates or reigns over Heidegger's discourse. For example, and here I'm quoting Heidegger's Ear, the last quote, "Very difficult to translate, Walton. Walton carries a weight all the heavier since, on the one hand, the word is inseparable from a certain polemos, and since, on the other hand, Heidegger makes of this word quite simply, at a certain point, the synonym of Anwesen in two words, presence, indeed of aletheia. The An of Anwesen, what makes come to presence this unfolding of a physis remaining, however, in itself, is the force or the violence of this Walton." And earlier in this same text, he remarks that Walton will have long commanded all the thought of the Heraclitean polemos as Heidegger interprets it. But perhaps as well, Walton will have long commanded everything in Derrida's reading of Heidegger. So the luck of the leap that puts everything in a new perspective from the unusual crossing of two paths will have been perhaps the chance of a forgetting. This is what happens and ought to be meditated on endlessly. Thank you.
Okay, Naomi, just hang on a sec. We'll take Thomas first. And we have to speak into the microphone so that all the online people can hear us, and there's more than 60% of the conference online.
I'm so sorry, Naomi, I beat you to it. So thank you very much, Peggy. My question was a bit of another memory, and I wanted to know how your whole reflection on Trieb, drive, pulsion, pousser, poussance, could be maybe related to something you called quite a long time ago sexual drive in The Other Sexual Difference, which was already a reflection or reading of Derrida's reading of Heidegger. So, voilà.
Oh dear. Well, first of all, thank you, Thomas. And I hope you understood this was my contribution to your panel, kind of displaced. Yeah, thanks for that. I kind of got on Derrida's case a little bit at the end about forgetting, but there you go. I forgot. Yes, did forget that neologism. I mean, I think there's a good likelihood one could trace some path between trieb, poussance, and sexual drive. Yeah. So maybe you'll do that someday. Good.
We have Karen.
Okay, well, Thomas sort of stole my question, so we'll have to fight later. But yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with Trieb, and particularly with Freud's version of the Trieb. So I was very captivated by your elaboration on that. And one of the things that occurred to me was whether Derrida, through his sort of metonymic eloquence, was trying to insinuate a psychoanalytic understanding of the Trieb into Heidegger through his reading. That's one question. And then it opened up another question for me, which is whether there is something like a death drive in Heidegger, given the sort of, the limits that he places on drive through his notion of authentic being toward death and being in time, which is, obviously not all of Heidegger, but because it's, kind of the 1927. So, but, is there a way in which Derrida is finding or discovering a trace of the death drive in Heidegger through this reading that you've reproduced so beautifully and added to?
To your first question, I would say definitely yes. That although I can't recall, maybe someone else in the room can, the importance of references to Freud or psychoanalysis in the seminar. There is that one reference to Lacan that I mentioned, where Lacan makes the same distinction between human and animal, basically, that Heidegger's making. But as to your second question, I don't feel really competent to answer in any kind of at least assured way about a death drive in Heidegger and how Derrida might have wanted to bring that out here or elsewhere. Actually, I was reading, well, no, I shouldn't say that. It was about a paper that hasn't been given yet that I read in advance, so I don't want to ruin someone else's thunder. But it's a really interesting question. I mean, despite what Thomas just reminded me of, that I also wrote this other text on Derrida and Heidegger, and this one, I kind of have this idea that I don't write about Heidegger and don't have anything to say about Heidegger, that which is true because I always come at Heidegger through Derrida. To the extent I come at Heidegger at all. So, yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Katie, and Naomi, just hang on. We've got 2 more people before you, and then it's you're up. So Katie first.
Peggy, that was totally awesome. I just wanted to sort of toss a few threads your way. The first of which would be in a way that's actually pretty uncanny, and I hadn't seen it before. The passages on the leap here are, I mean, and you might have been thinking of this too, so close to the 84-85 seminar and what has now been published as Geschlecht 3, like the leaps of the reading and the leaps and the interruptions and the turning back and even arriving at a point where you get, I think what he there calls not a survol but something, right? Like that perspective. It's very, very similar, except there it is tracking Heidegger's language. I mean, it's tracking his moves and his gestures in the reading of Kakel, but it's also more closely following his language. And it's also there that the Absprung is related to an Ursprung that is there, the source of the Gedicht, right? Like the source of the poem that would be the one poem that would be something like Kakel's poetic idiom, except, there Derrida is going to point sort of, Heidegger wants the idiom to be going back towards the source, whereas Derrida's counter-thinking of the idiom is doing errance, right, does not have a destination, except that in a way that starts to look like Robinson Crusoe not knowing whether the footprint on the beach is his own foot or the foot of another. The leaps, the Derrida leaps and the Heidegger leaps start to cross each other and even become sort of indecipherable, right? So that would be one thing to think about, right? Whether the leaping, whether there can be sort of ultimately a way of deciding between the one and the other when Derrida is reading Heidegger. But just to sort of thread back in some of that Geschlecht stuff, and even it's interesting about the forgetting, at the very end of that text, that beautiful moment of the eclipse, where Derrida talks about the force of a text precisely, and there, I don't know to what extent that force could be put in dialogue with the poussance or de la poussance, right, that you're talking about. But the force of a text or of a reading is precisely its ability to sustain, going dark and returning, right, to sustain eclipses of, sort of disappearance and reappearance. And again, Heidegger, that encore Heidegger of that seminar. And then just the last little thread to throw would be in those very copies. Derrida sort of makes a show in the beginning of the seminar of holding up in, one book in each hand, the Robinson Crusoe and the Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. And what's remarkable is if you open those copies of his books, that the kind of reading idiom that you find there marked out or traced out is precisely a leaping from word to word, right? You don't find anything like, you do find underlining, but you really find sort of gestures and stresses and inflections, but also circled words, like that wheel in Robinson Crusoe is traced, but also vaulten. So when you find that vaulten, that surgissement, right, that kind of popping up of the word as a force, there's something that's happening on the level of gesture, hand, mark in Derrida's reading that is meeting that in a way that I don't know how to think about that yet, but I think there's something there. Anyway, sorry, that's just a lot.
No,
thank you for the talk.
That's all really interesting and helpful and thought-provoking, especially your first remark about the overlap with Geschlecht 3, which I will have to go back. There's another place that I've written about Derrida and Heidegger. It's true. But I've become really interested in the figure, I don't know what to call it, of leap and reading in leaps. I think it's very common, and not just in Derrida. And yet, Derrida acknowledges it, recognizes it, highlights it, foregrounds it, as if there were something a bit illegitimate about making such leaps without any kind of ground under your feet and without a logical progression, right? And a syllogism. But you're leaping, and it's wherever you land. And I think that happens in a lot of writers, actually. I mean, thinking of Cixous in particular, I think a lot about Cixous, but I think her writing also acknowledges that the force or the poussance of the leap. So as for the other points, yeah, we'll talk.
Okay, so we have a question, in-person question, and then Naomi, you'll be up.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It reinforced in me this conviction that perhaps more than in the case of any other text, this one should be read not only in French but aloud also. That one should read this aloud.
But also what?
Excuse
Not
me?
only in French, but
But
also
aloud.
Aloud.
When you read it, you should read it aloud. And I was wondering because when we talk about drive, about wheel, about vehicles, there are also beautiful passages about speed, about racing, and I was wondering on your thoughts on this particular themes in the second volume of the Beast and Sovereign seminars. Thank you.
Well, I like that idea that it should be read aloud. I think that's true of most everything Derrida wrote. And I paused here at one point just to remark on that, how, you know, a sentence or a sentence fragment can just concentrate a kind of rhythmic and syntactic but also philosophic power, to use that word, that you're right, giving voice to it brings it out better. So I'm glad you heard that.
Thank you. We'll take a question from Naomi Walton-Smith,
Who is
online. So you can just stay where you are.
See her.
Yeah, you can now.
There you
Yeah.
are. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Peggy. Thanks so much for your lovely paper and for not quite taking everything I wanted to say in the panel already. But we do have lots of common themes. I had a question about the note on which you began your keynote when you were highlighting this question of key or tone of the keynote address. And I was wondering if I might invite you to say whether you've thought at all about the oral or sonic qualities of poussance. And while you're thinking, maybe I can think of three sort of texts where this might arise. One already Katie has mentioned, Geschlecht 3, where, you know, we have Heidegger, we have the leaps in reading, we have the idiom, we have Walton briefly, but also then this question of Grundton or fundamental tone and the unifying of that. Then I'm also thinking of another place where there's a leap to do with key or tone, which is in L'animal donc que je suis, where Derrida will talk about wanting to change the opposition, the sort of pomorphizing opposition between animal and human. And he says we would need a change of key, but specifically he says by some sort of high notes up on the stave. So kind of leaping up sonically in some way. But the last one, and I guess this is what I'd really like to ask you about, is where pousser comes up in Cixous' writings, and specifically in Jourdelin, where she talks about, she's talking about Celan's cello Einsatz, and she says, derrière la douleur, so translating hinter dem Schmerz, and she says, le poème pousse le poème, and there it is explicitly connected with with the sonorous, she says, la douleur c'est qui chante, and there's also kind of a sense of it's the swelling up of something musical in the chest. I can't remember all of the details of this passage, but it's not the only place where Cixous will give a particularly sonorous resonance to this poussée. And so I guess it was an invitation given you are someone who's thought about orality a lot as well in these writers, whether you had thought about that connection at all. Thanks, Peggy.
Well, that connects to the previous question, which I hope you heard. Oh, I have to speak. Huh? That connects to the previous question somewhat. Did I think about sonority, orality? I mean, I have to say, I mean, what is the key in a keynote? It was kind of my question. And I confess that I didn't think of musical key. However, now I do. No, that's good. It's strange. I mean, I think I've always thought of keynote as something like keystone, you know, the sort of what is holding everything together, which is grandiose. But I do like the association to music, and you've just confirmed my intimation or my sense that Cixous is a rich place to look for both leaps, and I wasn't thinking of poussée and poussance, but now I am, thanks to you. And I will.
Thank you. Peggy. Sorry, I'm not there.
Okay, so Eliza Ballas.
So thank you, Peggy. It was amazing to have a chance to hear you, and I'm even about to maybe repeat some of the points of my colleagues that have been questioning you, but also I thought about Cixous, but maybe, and my question is more. I think de puissance and de poussée, peut-être. Maybe it's more related to a text, one text from Derrida, C'est la vie, that he wrote in relation with Alain Cixous. But even I'm thinking maybe, and I know that you're thinking about it, the poussée and the puissance. What about the question for the sexual difference between that? How can we think the relation between Cixous and Derrida and the difference they both made between la vie, la mort, for example, even that text, C'est la vie, and also Cixous, the latest text that she wrote, like the rêve and everything around the relation that she had with Derrida. So what about the question that we might right now pose in relation to the sexual difference with the poussée and puissance? Think about it in the middle of La Vie, la Mort. I know it's something that you're thinking about it, and it's everything came out right now. But I have been working lately with the question of sexual difference and the sexual. Also, Thomas had also put the question in the middle. So the question is, how can we think the la pousse, la puissance, or even the difference in it, about the sexual difference, not also in the sexual, but also in la vie, la mort? The difference that they both put it, you're also thinking about la vie, and you're always thinking about la mort, and the relation they always put in the middle of the thinking, on the middle of the writing. So the sexual, and the text and everything, it's maybe something in the middle of la vie, la mort. I don't know, but that's something that came around my mind when I hear your paper, and also when my colleagues also put the questions all around the conversation. So that's it. Thank you everything to all of you, and for Lista, to you, Peggy, and nice to meet you.
So to speak. Wow. Well, what these questions, your question, Naomi's question, all of the questions I've heard and not really responded to, except it's given me just a lot to think about, but especially makes me want to reread all the text you're mentioning, as if what has happened is not really a new perspective, but there's some other angle to follow. And I mean, I think with Cixous, it's endless. And yeah, because her work is so enormous. The other thing is, I don't have electronic files of Cixous' work, so you can't do word searches. I mean, I have a few of them, but there aren't many available as far as I know. And it helps to be able to do word searches. I tell you, I mean, Beast and the Sovereign, I searched for so and leap and, and I remember Derrida once remarking that he wrote grammatology before there were word searches, and found all of these suppléments, suppléés, and et cetera, without the aids that we have now. So all I can do is thank you for, thank you for this reinforcement that there is something there, and to keep going with it if I have the time and the courage. Yeah, that'll do.
No, it won't. We've got 2 more questions. Is that okay?
Okay.
And then that's it. So we have one up the back here.
Hi, thank you for the clarity of your talk. I thought it was very nice. So I just have a quick comment and then a very non-technical question. Another leap that you might consider too in this is the leap in time. As I recall, at the beginning of the seminar, he talks about how he hadn't read Crusoe in 50 years. And so it's a big leap to him to return to that text. But my other question has to do with when you say every step is a leap, I think of the foot, especially with Robinson Crusoe. So do you feel like these are leaps forward, leaps backwards, leaps sideways? Because when you're talking about Heidegger, you're usually talking about a circularity. And do you view these leaps as forms of dances? So, thank you.
Thanks. Well, I quoted that one passage, the Absprung and the Ursprung, where it's a leap backward to the origin in order to, I don't know, leap forward. But maybe just to bring in another reference here is Kierkegaard. And I've been reading Kierkegaard lately. And of course, his figure of the leap and leaping is often a dance. There's often a figure of a dancer, or someone so overcome with emotion and joy that they leap for just in place, just jump in place. which he admires, or the narrator of the text, whoever it is, admires. So I'm really interested in the Kierkegaardian leap, and I'm sure there's just, whole libraries written about this. So it's a bit daunting, given how late it is for me to be reading Kierkegaard. I don't know what you all think about that insistence on every step is a leap. But it's rather striking. And the fact that he writes it once, and then I think he himself was struck by it. So he wrote it again. And then he wrote it a third time with even more emphasis, or more, it was more affirmative and categorical. And of course, that is how walking is described, as kind of continuous falling forward that you stop, right? And maybe it doesn't look like what we call a leap, but there's a kind of moment of indecision, or a moment of where everything could go awfully wrong, right? When you're up in the air or balanced on one foot. So you could understand it like that. But I think I haven't stopped thinking. I haven't finished thinking about that clearly.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you for the great richness of your talk. You recapitulated Vermögen as power, and another possibility would probably be Vermögen as wealth of multiplication, diversification, differentiation, which brings us back to ontological difference. So what do we make of Derrida's insistence to not abandon Weiten to neutrality? What does this imply for ontological difference and its violent resonances? Maybe there's something you could say about that.
If there is, it doesn't come to mind. I'm sorry. And I'm going to beg off again by just an inability to kind of dive into Heidegger at large. But I'm sure you're right. I mean, obviously, these are key notions in Heidegger, and very powerful words that I'm sure he exploits in all sorts of ways. But one thing that occurred to me, I forgot to mention it when it was apt, but and it was because we have mentioned Cixous several times, and indeed that book that Derrida wrote on one of the books he wrote on Cixous is her use of puissance, of puis and puissance. Thomas, again, has written about this beautifully. But how she is able to kind of rescue that notion of puissance as not a power, but as in the sense that it ordinarily has, but as a promise, as a promising opening of something, which is what Derrida brings out by following this lexicon of puis, which is the subjunctive, right? Que cela puisse arriver, that this might happen, that let this happen, let this be the case. So I think maybe to look for a connection to this other thinking of puissance would also be a good use of my time.
Peggy, thank you so much. Look, and I'd like to present you with an Australian bottle of wine, all the way from Australia.
Oh my gosh.
Came in Julian's suitcase, and some chocolates.
Wine, I hope.
Wine, red. I hope you drink red. And some Australian chocolates with indigenous plants like lemon myrtle and quandong. So, thank you so much. Can we just all thank?
That was such a nice thing to do. Thank you.